Hello and welcome to Book Talk with Kara, where today my friend Gabrielle Meyers is back and we are going to talk about her third book in this wonderful time slip, time travel. I never quite know what to call it other than I love this series and you mess with me again with For a Lifetime. Oh my word. I
I
knew
don't
what you
know
were
if I should apologize or cheer.
Well, it was one of those, I knew what you were going to do because if I were not there, I would have done the same thing. And yet when you did it, it was like, I can't believe you did that. But then I was like, but you had to. But before we get to talking about this amazing book, I want to talk about what we were literally just talking about. I went, stop, pause. We've got to hit record because this is what writing is all about. And this is the stuff that people who listen to the podcast are always like, we want to know what's it really like. And so today's a Wednesday as we're recording this.
Mhm.
Yesterday was release day for a
Yep.
Lifetime.
Yep.
And you were just telling me all the things you were doing with all the different books and all the things. So
Yeah.
writing is like that. So what, I mean, okay.
Yeah.
Release day was yesterday, but that's not all you're doing. There were all these other things
Right.
going on. So what is a slice of the last week and your writing life look like right now?
Yeah. It's kind of weird because you have to write a book a year before it releases. And so that usually means that your deadline for your next book is right at the same time that you're releasing, the next book in the series. So how my last week looked was on Friday, I handed in book number 5 in the Timeless series. So there will be at least 5 books. I handed that in on Friday. Then through the weekend, I worked on a proposal for a different series that we're talking about at Bethany House. I'm not going to share any details yet, but
Oh, come
we're all
on.
super we're all super excited about it. Um, and so I handed that in on Monday. And then on Tuesday was release day for a Lifetime. Oh, and I forgot Monday night, I did a podcast with the Redeeming Lit podcast, and they were asking me about the first book in the series. So, I had to go back and think about the first book. And yeah, so now I'm releasing book number 3, talking about book number 1. I just finished book number 5, and I just got edits for book number 4 just today. So I'm going to start working on that. So that's, that we were talking before we started recording that that's just one sliver of our life, right? Because we also
Yeah.
have families and we also have other jobs and things like that. And so this is just, you just have to learn how to compartmentalize when you're an author. All of us do. We all have to figure out how to do what we do. But specifically for authors, you're juggling 4 or 5 different stories at any given time, and you have to keep it all straight.
And then you have to go back and remember the character names from a book, in that case, 3, 5, 6 books ago, depending on how you're looking at it. And yesterday I had someone ask me, so can you project manage? And I went, oh, I almost laughed out loud, like hysterically. I'm like, can I project manage? You have no idea.
Right.
Here, let me give you one small little example because it just made me laugh. I'm like, I said, I'm a mom. I'm like, that should
Right.
be enough right there. But then I wanted to be like, I'm a novelist, but that wasn't relevant for what we were talking about because it
Mhm.
really is that kind of a situation where you're like, okay, the characters from that book back then were this and let's just stop and talk about the fact you get to write 5 books in this series. That is
Yeah.
so unusual today. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. So For a Lifetime was the 3rd book in the series. That was all I had proposed. That was what I was contracted to write. And the series has just blown up. I am just really in awe of all of the readers who are loving these stories, who are asking for more, who are, requesting them at their libraries, buying them for friends. And that's, I think, the best message to give to readers is if you find a series of books that you like, if you find an author, share about it and support those authors as best you can. And it doesn't always mean just buying their book, but putting out reviews or sharing it on your social media. And there is just this whole group of people who have just fallen in love with these books, and because of that, I was asked to continue the series. And we're in a cool place with it right now because the 5th book is written. That's coming out in May of 2025. Book 4 comes out November of this year, 24. And we're kind of waiting to see what happens. I have an idea for book 6, but we haven't quite decided if we're going to go to book 6 or not. So we're just kind of waiting to see if the trend continues with this series. And I have enough ideas. I can keep going as long as people want to read about it.
I'm just so excited for you because I really thought, okay, for a lifetime, book number 3, the way that publishing is going, that's it. And I was kind of sad
Mhm.
because it's like, I love the concept. It's so fresh, it's so original. And I'm not into fantasy. That's just not my
Right.
thing. But the
Hmm.
way you've done this with the time slip and the you wake up in one world and then the next day you wake up in another time period and then you're back and forth between the two. And the way you did this one with twins, and
Yeah.
one's telling the time period during the Salem Witch Trials, and one is telling the time period in 1912,
Yep.
sort of.
So like, yeah,
It's kind of it's fun because it's
yeah.
very you've got the split going on. So how did you come up with that? Because that's different from what you did with the other books.
Right. I think that one of the reasons why this series is continuing to build steam, because that's kind of what's happening each time a
Yeah.
new book releases, it's kind of kicking up sales for book number 1 too, so like it's just kind of building as we're going, and all of us are excited about it. I met with my agent and editor recently, and everybody's just really excited. But I think that one of the reasons why it's doing that is because it's the same kind of premise, the same idea of a person or two people who go back and forth between these two lives, and then at one point, whether it's their 21st birthday or 25th, they have to decide which life to keep and which to forfeit. The first one is, Libby, one woman. The second book, there's 3 timelines, so that's different. And a lot of people have said to me, usually when I read a second book, I don't really like it as much because the first one was like, wow, that was such a cool concept. But they said the second book, because it had 3 timelines, 3 completely different timelines, it was still just as exciting. And then now the third book, there's twins and they're going back and forth together. So that's unique. With the fourth book, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but the heroine in that one doesn't have a time crossing parent. She was abandoned by her time crossing parent for reasons that you
Ooh.
learn about. And so her story, it's set in 1727 and 1927, so the pirates and the gangster era. And she's trying to find her mother. And the last she heard, she might be a pirate. And so she heads down. She has to dress as a man to try to get down to Nassau, Bahamas. And so she's on a quest to find out why she is like this. She has no idea. And so that's unique and different. And then the fifth one, the heroine lives in 1888 and 1938. So she only has 50 years between her time, and so that adds a different dynamic too.
Yeah.
And 1938, so this is a fifth book. 1938, she works as a curator for the Smithsonian, and she's invited to London, to the London Museum. When she gets there, she's asked to put together an exhibit, and it's the 50th anniversary of Jack the Ripper. And when she's doing her research, she finds out that her sister from 1888 will
Is
be the
killed.
last victim of Jack the Ripper. So she has to decide, because part of the rules of time crossing is if you knowingly change history, you forfeit that timeline. So she has to decide, how can she save her sister? She doesn't want to forfeit that timeline. And she also has to decide if she's going to unmask the man that history has decided to keep secret. So, each book is the same
Oh,
premise, but
it's so
completely
different.
different. Yeah. So, and the idea I have for the sixth book is, again, different. It would be 2 point of views, a brother and a sister who share one timeline and go to separate timelines.
And
So,
that
and
would be very different from the twins who go
yes,
to stay in the same timelines and going
yes,
back and forth. And I thought
yep,
that the twins in For a Lifetime was so fresh because it added, what if they chose different timelines? And I don't want to
mm-hmm,
spoil anything. Or what if they choose to stay together because that twin bond is
yep,
so tight? And then you did something to add a
mm-hmm,
layer of complexity to that choice. And by
mm-hmm,
removing a choice, sort of. But
yep,
again, I don't want to
yep,
give a spoiler. And so
yep.
it was so fresh and different. And so it's just, you keep making it unique and fresh. And I think there's something about that that takes so much creativity. And we've talked in a prior episode about how you kind of came
Yep,
up with the original idea, but
yep,
how do you keep picking these time periods? Because the Salem Witch Trial, talk about a very bleak time in our history. Um,
right.
I mean, even just reading that timeline is
Mm-hmm.
hard because
Yep,
it would be
it
kind
is.
of like reading about the era of Reconstruction,
Mm-hmm.
or there are just these moments in our history that it would be really easy just to kind of try and pretend that did not happen because it's
Right.
just dark.
Yep.
So how did you go, okay, I want to invest 6 months of my life in
Yeah.
living in that time period?
Yeah. So a few things came into play. The first is that I've always been fascinated by the Salem witch trials, and it wasn't until I was well, it was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I was doing genealogy, and I knew that I had connection to Puritan Massachusetts. I had a lot of ancestors who came over during the Puritan migration. But it wasn't until like 5 or 6 years ago that I was digging deeper and I found that I actually have ancestors on both sides of the Salem witch trials. So I have the Proctors and the Putnams. And that just blew my mind. So when I went back to, I've been to Salem now 4 times. So when I went back to Salem, I saw it in a different connection. Like, wow, this
Yeah.
has a more personal, meaning to me. And so when I came up with the idea, the original idea for the series, one of the things about these time crossers is that they have something very unique. And these are Christian fiction, and so this is looked at as a gift from God. But I thought about it. I'm like, if they ever let it be known that this was something that they had, it could be looked at as witchcraft. It could be looked at as, what's up with these women and whatever. And so I just thought, wow, to put them in Salem with this gift would up the stakes even more. And then I have two different sisters who are actually inspired by my girls, who are, well, almost 18 and 20. And they have such different personalities. And I thought, what if I had taken their personalities and put them in Salem? And I know my Marin, who's actually sitting next to me right now doing college schoolwork, I know she would be like, gonna play by the rules. I'm not gonna ruffle any feathers. We're just gonna wait till our time is done. Whereas my other daughter, Ellis, I know she would just be pressing all the buttons. She would be like, you can't hurt me, you can't touch me. And so that was kind of how I brought hope and grace into that, is those are my girls, and that's how they would respond to those time periods. So that was really how I came across, the idea of using Salem. And it is a dark time. And I really feel like it's so commercialized in
Yeah.
Salem. And I'm even on like some Facebook groups, descendants of Salem witch trials, and a lot of the people on there celebrate it as witchcraft, and it breaks my heart because the people who died were innocent. They were innocent of all of it. And so to claim that it was witchcraft just breaks my heart. So that was another reason I wanted to kind of set the
Yeah.
record straight about what actually was going on there.
Yeah. And I think you do a beautiful job of highlighting the complexity of the time and the complexity of what was happening. And, it was, we want to say it was a very simple time, but actually it was a time of survival. And so because of
Mm-hmm.
that, that heightens the stakes for everybody. And it's like
Yes.
when you're surviving versus thriving, it puts a spin
Mm-hmm.
on everything that makes it more difficult and
Yes.
challenging. And so, it's just different. But then you've got 1912. And
Yeah.
that's a very different time period. It's not the roaring
Mm-hmm.
20s, but it's kind of close to that. And so it was
Right.
like this real stark juxtaposition. So how did
Mm-hmm.
you land on that?
So, a couple of different reasons. First, because Salem is such a dark, hard period, I wanted to have the opposite kind of, the thriving period. That before World War II, after that Reconstruction era, there was just a lot of thriving going on, a lot of innovation, a lot of technology was coming out, and so I wanted to, like contrast those two time periods. But I also worked at the Charles Lindbergh Historic Site for 10 years in my hometown. And Charles Lindbergh was an early aviator, not quite 1912, he was 1927. But I've always been fascinated by early aviation. And it's,
Mhm.
and a lot of people have said that there's some feminism in my books, which I think is kind of funny because I don't set out to make them some kind of feminist
Yeah.
statement. But in 1912, when women were kind of coming into their own. They were stepping out and doing things that previous generations hadn't done. And one of them was they were at the forefront of aviation. And it was such a cool thing to learn about a lot of these women, how they were breaking records of their own and doing a lot of things that they had more courage than I. would have ever
Yeah.
had to do that, because every 10 days between 1911 and 1912, pilot died. And they considered it the necessary sacrifice for the advancement of aviation. But every pilot who was flying at that time knew that the chance of their death was very high. So that puts a different spin on things too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those
Wow.
are some of the reasons I chose those two different time periods.
I love that. And it created a really interesting dynamic between the sisters and their choices and all of that. But you also slid the age of choice back because it was
Yes.
25. Why'd you do
Yeah.
that? Because I would be like, you got to get them out of Salem because they could die from disease and sickness and that. Getting to 25 at
Right.
that time period would not be easy, especially staying single till 25 in that time
Right.
period.
So the reason for that, without giving spoilers, is because after book one, we learned that there are two different kinds of time crossers. So the one has a mark on the front, and from where they're born to their time crossing parent, they go forward in time and they get 21 years. There's other time crossers who have the mark at the back of their head, and from where they're at with their time crossing parent, they go back in history and they get 25 years. And so the way it played out, these girls are Maggie's twins, and Maggie is a heroine from the first book. And so she chooses a specific timeline. And so I had to decide, do I want to go forward from that timeline or do I want to go back? And forward from that timeline, I couldn't really think of anything beyond 1912 that I wanted to use, but I wanted to go back with them. And so they got the mark at the back of their head, which then gave them 25 years. So that was the reason why. It wasn't because I wanted them to suffer, but because that was kind of the rules that I had set up in the first book, and so needed to continue that.
Yeah. And I guess it's been enough time since I've read book
Yeah,
one
that's
that I
fine.
forgot the rules. And I was just like,
Yeah,
25, that's not right. But I'm like, I knew
yeah,
there was a reason. So,
yep, yep.
um, my next question was it's the last book in the series, but it's not.
No,
Yay. So I'm so
yeah.
excited. But you are coming up. One of the things you did over the last week was you came up with your next series idea.
Mhm.
Because you don't know if there's going to be a book 6 or book 7, which who
Right.
knows, you've already broken the rule.
I
Um,
know.
and that's always my hardest thing. Like I've got to start coming up with my next series idea because I'm writing the
Mhm.
third book in a series and ugh, I hate
Yeah,
it. It's so much
yeah.
work. So how do you come up with it? Do you have like I was talking with Jen Toronto yesterday and she has her idea box. And so she just starts
Mhm.
going through her idea box and going, what's the next idea? Do you have a system like that? Or are you like me where you beat your head against a wall wishing you had an idea box? You know?
Um, it's a little bit of both, I guess. Um, every time I'm doing research for one book, I'm inevitably finding information that I'm like,
Yeah.
oh man, I wish I could put that in this book, but it would not have anything to do with it. And so I do kind of keep a list of fun historical settings that I would like to play around with. And so, just talking with my editor and discussing, like what's our strategy moving forward. I will be doing 2 books a year for Bethany House. And so we're like, okay, let's continue doing one timeless book a year just to kind of see, if we keep up the readership. And then let's start talking about maybe doing a second series that we can parallel with it. And so we got together with my agent and the three of us did a bunch of brainstorming and I just love that. That's the thing
Yeah.
that another thing that people need to know about writers is we've got a whole team and that's awesome because everybody has the same desire for your books to do well and to get to as many people as possible. And so I wrote down a list of things that I wanted to make sure that I do in every single book. I want to make sure I have that good, compelling drama. I want to make sure I'm using a fun historical timeline that I enjoy. I want to make sure that there's, romance in it. But I also we came up with the idea that we kind of want to keep that magical realism going, but not in a way. So like with the timeless books, the only magical realism, which is what it's called, is the time crossing element. So then we discussed like how could we bring that into another series that has history and family and drama and all of that. And so we landed on an idea. And I've already kind of run it by my editor and she loved it, but I needed to kind of hone it a little bit. And so I'm waiting back to hear from her if I've got the green light, and then I'll be able to share it. But it will be so much fun to write. That's all I
I
can
love
say
that.
is It will
Yeah,
have all of the things that people love about my timeless books. It will not have the time crossing, but it will have another fun little supernatural element to it, just slight, a little bit to it. So,
I love that. And then that allows you to play. And that's one of the things that,
mhm,
as I'm thinking about my next series, I told my agent, I need to have fun with the next one. It doesn't mean it
mhm,
won't have suspense in it, but it needs to feel like fun for me. Because
yep,
like the book I turned in that I'm editing right now was a courtroom drama. So like the plotting was a lot of work because
mhm,
there's a structure to it that you have to
yep,
hit, or it's just not going to be real. And so I worked so hard on the plotting and it worked, but now I'm working on the characterization and all that stuff. That's easier,
sure,
but
yeah,
it was work. And then, the next one I'm doing, I got to start writing really soon because it's due in December. I'm like, I've got general ideas. It'll be fine. It'll come together. And it's the capstone for this series where I have to pull together the like overarching thread. But I'm like, I want to
mhm,
have more fun. I want it to feel more like a caper or something like that.
yep,
But who knows if the editor let me do it? But it's one of those where you're just like that you have to know what's going to keep you engaged and what still stays
mhm,
true to what readers expect, but then has that little deviation so that as a writer, you are still having fun and growing and
yeah,
challenging yourself and all of that. So I
yep,
love it. So you
yeah,
write a lot. You write a
mhm,
lot. And what gets easier for you the more that you write? Because like I find there are certain things that are easier, but with each book, and I think you're the same way. We don't want readers to just pick up a book and go, oh, this is Kara's novel from that year with just the
right,
names of the characters changed. We
right,
always want it to feel like it's new, it's fresh, but that takes work. That's a lot of
mhm,
effort to keep upping the stakes. So
yep.
what gets easier for you? What gets harder for you the more that you write?
That's a great question. I've never actually thought about that. I think one of the things about writing, again, the writing life is there's different kinds of hard work. The creativity part of it, that's the hardest. Just finding that idea, that premise, that hook that's going to really excite you and excite your reader and excite your editor and everybody. That's the hard part. The editing part has gotten easier for me. And it's because I do a lot of my plotting and outlining up front. I do all of the kind of heavy lifting right at the front of my project so that I have everything laid out. I have my spreadsheet, has every scene in it, so that by the time I sit down to actually do the writing, it just flows so effortlessly. Um, and that's where I kind of, decorate and fill in and characterization and all of the fun stuff. And so I would say that the plotting continues to be the hardest part, just
Mhm.
to try to get all of the pieces in place. The I would say galley edits are the easiest. That's
Yeah.
like basically the last stage where you really can't change much. You're just reading to make sure, everything looks good. And um, but yeah, for sure the plotting would be the hardest part. And then the actual writing is the easiest part for me. Just
Yeah.
now I
And
get to have fun.
that
Yeah.
makes sense to me because the plotting, and I agree with you, when I do it, when I make myself actually go through the steps and do it, it makes the writing so easy because I've done the pre-thinking and I thought it out, and you know that the plot's going to work and you've got it, and it's just at that point I call it stringing beads together. And then
Yep.
it's just like I can sit down and I write because I know exactly where the story is going, and it's
Yep.
so effortless in a lot of ways because the hard work's been done and my subconscious
Hmm.
has been working on it.
Yep.
But it's so boring. you know but that's what I need to do this summer is the hard work of
Yeah.
the plotting, so that
Hmm.
then when the school year's going crazy, all I have to do is I sit down, I pull up my spreadsheet, and I go, oh, this is what I'm writing tonight, and
Yep.
and it's done.
Yep.
And so it's just that process. So last question as we wrap up. What's the last book or a recent book you read that just surprised you and made you go,
Hmm.
oh, I wish I had written that book. So for me, like one of them that recently was Catherine Ray's Berlin Letters.
Mm,
I
right.
read it and I was like, I could have written that. I wish I'd had the idea first because it's beautiful. And it's got that dual timeline, and I love Berlin and I love the history. And I was like, oh, she beat me to it. It's so great.
I hate to say this, but the last couple of years I have not read as much as I would like to read. I
Because you're
used to read,
writing.
I used to read 1 or 2 books a week, and I just was giving somebody advice yesterday, like, what's your best advice for an aspiring author? And I'm like, read as much as you can. But at this point, I haven't read a lot. Um, I can't even think of the last book I read. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. And that's an
Bunch
honest
on my
answer.
yeah. So one, there is actually a book that I read that, like, when you said that, it actually stood out to me, but I read it like about a year and a half ago. So Mimi Matthews, she wrote, it's a retelling of Jane Eyre, but it's called John Eyre. And
Oh,
so it has some of the same like gothic elements, and then it has some of that magical realism where you're like, is that real or is that not real? Like, it just was really well done. In all of her books, it was so different because I've read all of her, historical romances, but that was one that I was like, wow, that was a really cool retelling that I wish I had thought of, because Jane Eyre is such a cool story as it is. But yeah, so that, and of all, yeah, I was just looking at it the other day. I can't remember why, but it doesn't have as many reviews as most of her books. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I wish that it had taken off
yeah.
more, because it was such a cool story.
I love that. And see, that's perfect because a year and a half later, it still sticks out to you. So that's a
Yeah.
great example of one of those books. Because for me, I also remember there was a Susan Meisner book. I think it was The Girl in the Mirror or The Girl in the Glass, but I was reading it while I was on study abroad in Florence or Siena. And it's a story set, one of her dual timelines where part of it's set in Italy. And it was another one of those. It was just so gorgeously written. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, I wish. And I love reading, and I love so many of your, my friends writing and stuff. But there's only every once in a while I'm like, oh, I wish I'd written like
Right.
that. And
Yeah.
that was one of
It's
them where it was like,
fresh. Yeah.
yes. And you're just like,
Hmm.
oh, it's so gorgeous. All right. Well, thank you so much in this crazy week for coming on.
That's
I
okay.
absolutely love these books and for a lifetime. And I was so thrilled that this is not the end of the series like I thought it was. I'm one of those who's always like, you have to read this series. It's so, so good. And this
Thank you.
one with the twins jumping between the Salem Witch Trials and 1912. Such a fun twist on the story. And now I can't wait to read book 4 and 5. So thank you so much for joining me.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.